Okay, everyone, welcome. We're going to have a conversation about Syria and imperialism today. I was just asked to chair, so I haven't really prepared. So I'm just going to hand over to the speakers and let them introduce themselves. Are you okay to go first, Omar?
Yeah, sure. My name is Omar. Hi. I came to England to study at the University of Sussex a few years ago. I did international relations. I'm Egyptian, born and raised in the Middle East. Last few years I've been kind of getting involved in, at university I was involved in some kind of different forms of activism, Palestine solidarity stuff. Also we had the anti-privatization movement at our university, like a big occupation movement. I was involved in that as well. Last few years I've been involved also in Syria solidarity issues, and yeah, I suppose I've been freelancing recently, which is a fancy word of being unemployed, I guess. But no, he knows my pain. But yeah, I have been published in a few places, most recently The Guardian. So yeah, hopefully we'll get to talk about important issues today.
Why are you?
Sure. You've given a lot of history, so I'll go into the more recent period since the Arab Spring, I guess. What I've been interested in researching over the past few years is two particular elements. First of all, the relation of the US to the conflict and to the revolution or the uprising. And secondly, the relation of a lot of the left here, which is often linked very much to the first point of how they perceive US imperialism having acted in Syria. As an Egyptian, obviously we have very close links with each other, and for us, I don't like using this terminology of calling myself an activist or whatever, but obviously we have, to us, one uprising is the same as the others, and there's a very strong sense of solidarity, and so this is why I got very heavily involved around 2014 in kind of examining the conflict and studying it quite heavily. And main reason for that is because I found a lot of the rhetoric around me was quite convoluted on the conflict, including from people within the same left-wing spheres, and including by people within even the same pro-Palestine spheres, which I kind of was heavily involved in. And a lot of the narratives were basically that at this point, this was around 2013, 2014, that basically both sides are, Syria has many sides, but yeah, the opposition and the regime are equally as bad as each other, and basically the best we can do is just kind of stay out and maybe take care of refugees once they set foot into Europe. So if I start, I suppose, because I've not prepared this, so I'm kind of doing this impromptu. If I start, I suppose, with what US policy towards the Arab Spring generally has been. If we define the Arab Spring as, I define this, I suppose, the places where there was a demand for what we call regime change, or the people demanding the downfall of the regime, as the cry was. Maybe you have eight examples. Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Iraq. Iraq is quite a forgotten one. In 2012, 2013, there were big protests in Sunni areas. It wasn't nationwide, but it was in Sunni areas, and they considered themselves to be part of the Arab Spring, but this was very underreported, and it wasn't really covered. What did I say? Yemen, Bahrain, and Syria. Is that 7 or 8? I don't know. Anyway, I think generally if you look towards the US policy, towards the Arab Spring, and why I mentioned the US policy, of course there are divergences between the US and, let's say, the UK and France on certain aspects, but I think ultimately it's the US which has the main agency when it comes to the Western Bloc. It's been regime preservation minus the figurehead, and as you mentioned, I suppose, personnel change. So in Egypt, for instance, they said Obama said that Mubarak should step down eventually, and the rhetoric was, that kind of supportive of the democratic protests and etc. And this happened in also Yemen, where Ali Abdullah Saleh was backed by the United States for many decades, and they demanded very strongly for him to leave. And the reason I mention this is because there seems to be kind of there's a kind of a trend of counterconformity, which can be quite disturbing, whereby activists here in the West, often they want to oppose their governments, and especially after the Iraq War, it's very healthy, and it's very correct to be very skeptical and very scrutinizing of what your government says. But a lot of the narrative and a lot of the analyses which came on Syria proceeding from that point was that Western governments have supported the Arab Spring because of diplomatic expressions of support and rhetorical expressions of support, and therefore the Arab Spring has been kind of compromised in a sense, or there's some almost conspiratorial aspect to an extent. So I've had this personally told to me, like saying that the Arab Spring was just a CIA organized conspiracy, and telling me. Actually, the guy who told me this was in Brighton, which is where I'm mainly based. He told me. I said, okay, so he was actually hammering a Syrian, saying just because he condemned Assad to an extent, and he was like, "Do you support the U.S.-backed opposition? Do you support whatever? The Arab Spring is all a conspiracy." I was like, okay, I went to the streets in 2011, not in the revolution, but against the military council after Mubarak fell. Are you saying the CIA gave me a call and said go to the streets? And this is just generally a very poor understanding of mass politics. I think people who often say these kind of narratives, they don't understand how the real world, in a sense, works. You can't organize things like this, millions of people all with their own stories, going to the streets. And yeah, he said, yeah, effectively that's what I believed. The CIA called you and said go to the streets. And then we got to chatting, and he eventually was like, okay, let's sit down, have a tea and whatever. And I was like, okay, so the US policy in Egypt was essentially they told Mubarak to step down because they had to cut their losses. It's damage limitation. I see the Arab Spring in a sense as a massive bluff-calling exercise. So Western imperialists or the United States has always interfered in our affairs under the lofty rhetoric of democracy and freedom and liberty and etc. But in reality, their record, of course, has been generally supporting authoritarianism and dictatorship. The first coup in Syria's history, you mentioned the coups, the first coup that set a wave of coups in the 50s and 60s in 1949 was backed by the CIA, and it was against a democratically elected government. And so the US record regarding democracy is completely goes against their actions and their policies. But so when we have in the 21st century and in the age of mass media and social media this massive movement, and Western politicians are confronted and have to deal with this reality once it makes the media and makes coverage, of course they will have to say things like, yes, we support the legitimate demands of the people asking for democracy and freedom and all these kind of nice things. This shouldn't come as a surprise for anyone. And what I find surprising is that a lot of people on the left have thought that this is surprising, as if they expected the West in the 21st century, right? And everybody's seeing these protests being, repressed on live TV or on live social platforms. They expected the West to say, yes, we support Mubarak. Yes, we support Assad. Yes, we support Ali Abdullah Saleh. That's not a mature understanding of politics. And so generally the US policy was to distance themselves from the figurehead, that people at the top of the regime. So like I said, in Egypt, they said Mubarak should go. But who did they organize the transition? Who came after Mubarak? It was the Supreme Council of Armed Forces in Egypt's case, i.e. the military. And the US supported this transition whereby Mubarak stays, but then you put the military instead, changing people associate regimes often with a figurehead, a symbol, not with entire institutions and different state apparatuses. And so it was Mubarak to go, but this is what we say in Egypt often. We say we had a half-baked revolution. We didn't have a proper revolution, because all you had is Mubarak left, but then the generals took over. And right now in Egypt, the situation is much worse than during Mubarak, in terms of authoritarianism, in terms of liberties, in terms of corruption, all this kind of stuff. And yet, if we just take this superficial, surface level analysis of saying the US said Mubarak should go, this kind of gives a tick. They check the box of saying, yeah, we said that Mubarak should go. Yes, now we're supporting somebody who's 100 times worse, but the Arab Spring happened and we supported it. And so the reason for this long kind of prelude is that obviously these narratives were very important when it came to Syria, that there was a massive kind of US attempt to overthrow the regime, which firstly misunderstands the history of the US with the regime, and secondly misunderstands actual US policy towards the conflict. So often what is cited here is that, for instance, statements by Barack Obama or other American officials saying that Assad should step down, and this is often interpreted as supporting the regime change. But if you actually study the policy of the US on the ground and what people on the ground have been saying, activists and even rebel fighters and for years have been saying and arguing, and if you study even US statements, nuanced small print statements which don't get as much coverage, it was never regime change, and this is a complete misunderstanding. Their preference was the same as what happened in Egypt or what happened in Tunisia, which is an intra-regime coup in a sense. The regime itself sacrifices its figurehead to calm things down and try to, limit damage limitation, and try to kind of say to people, now you got what you want, now stop any reform. And this is, like I said, in Yemen, this same political solution happened whereby the ruling party stayed in power, effectively. Salah's party stayed in power, but Salah himself was pressured, kind of nudged out of the way, and he was given immunity and stuff like that. Like I said, this was the same in Egypt, whereby the military kind of nudged Mubarak out of the way, not because they wanted to. Ideally, they would have kept him, probably in my estimation, but because they knew that this was a losing battle. They'd better cut their losses and try and consolidate and play a long game. And they did it very effectively. If you want to study how to successfully conduct a counter-revolution, Egypt was a masterclass. Because, like I said, the military sacrificed Mubarak in a sense. They said they put him, eventually there were demands for him to be trialed. They said he went to jail, but he never went to jail. He went to a hotel kind of room, effectively, and was living fine. And basically they built on the credit with that. They said, look, you want to see what happens if the military stands against the people, against the protesters? Look at Syria, look at Libya. You should be grateful that we let Mubarak fall, effectively. And their strategy was quite, like I said, it was quite intelligent, because the regime remained intact. In Syria, for instance, the regime doesn't exist effectively anymore. And this is why I'm saying that the Egyptian model was very much more smart for people who have interest within the regime, the power centers and the economic centers. When I say this, in Syria the regime doesn't exist anymore, I mean that it's overwhelmingly reliant on foreign actors. I'm not just talking about Russia. If you look even about Assad's forces on the ground today, and for the past few years, since 2015 probably, the Syrian army, in a sense, is a minority amongst pro-regime forces. The main people fighting on the ground are the foreign jihadis you don't hear about. Hezbollah, for instance, Iraqi Shia militias, which are huge in number, actually. They outnumber Hezbollah. And these have been backed by actually the West inside Iraq against ISIS, and this is something which is very poorly known. I wrote a piece about this in the Huffington Post, and I've been trying to get the Labour Party to raise this in Parliament, but without much success. The Iraqi Shia militias, known as collectively as the Popular Mobilization Units, basically they were backed by the United States-led coalition against ISIS inside Iraq, in terms of providing air cover, for instance. Also, the central government gives them a lot of arms as well, and the central government is backed by Western powers. And Western powers know this, and yet they have become the single biggest component of pro-regime forces inside Syria. They outnumber massively Hezbollah. Even people always hear about Hezbollah, but they don't hear about the Iraqi militias, for instance, or the PMUs, Popular Mobilization Units. In Aleppo, when Aleppo fell in 2016, the main shock troops were these Iraqi units, not Hezbollah. And out of 6,000 troops who went into Aleppo representing the regime, 5,000 were foreign. Which obviously completely makes a mockery of the regime's narrative of fighting a foreign agenda and defending state sovereignty and etc. Anyway, so in terms of U.S. policy on the rebellion, it's always been actually regime preservation, and this is what a lot of activists have said. Now, their first preference, like I said, was what happened in Egypt and Yemen, whereby the regime itself cleanses itself from this guy, probably gives him some kind of immunity in a political deal, and the Syrian army. When I say the regime, mainly the Syrian army. And there was a Wall Street Journal article in 2011 which said this, that the U.S. maintained strong links with the Syrian military during this year, and they were trying to get the Syrian military to kind of nudge Assad out. Why this didn't happen, and they call this a political solution. Actually, the Americans themselves have always said, okay, it would be useful to have a marker here. There are three positions, I suppose, you can have on the Syrian conflict. You can have a regime military victory, a rebel military victory, and what is called a political solution. The U.S. have actually declaredly always opposed the rebel military victory, and I can direct you to various statements to that effect. They've always said there's no military solution to the conflict, and that both sides have to sit on the table. Assad should go, but as part of a negotiated settlement. And by that, their first preference, and this is how I kind of categorize it. Their first preference was, like I say, a regime preservation solution whereby Assad himself steps down, but the rest of the regime remains intact. But that wasn't available in the Syrian context, unlike Egypt, unlike Tunisia, unlike Yemen. And the reason that wasn't available is because the Syrian regime has a very different character from those regimes. It's much more patrimonial. It's not an institutionalized regime. So in Egypt, for instance, the military existed as an institution, separate. Mubarak was one of their own, and he was powerful, but they could operate without him. They could survive without him. You didn't have a sectarian dynamic in a place like Egypt. Yemen has a bit of a sectarian dynamic, but not really, not to the same extent as you did in Syria. In Syria, the regime and its military and security and intelligence apparatuses were always dominated at the high upper echelons by Alawites, member of Assad's sect. Now, a lot of people say that, does this mean that Assad represents an Alawite regime? No, he doesn't represent an Alawite regime, but in terms of those key positions in key junctures of the state, he relied, and his father before him relied on Alawites in, especially, like I said, the top of the military and security and intelligence apparatuses. In reality, actually, most Alawites remained poor under the Assad family. Hafiz al-Assad, you mentioned he took power in a coup. He was actually the right wing of the Ba'ath party, and he took power in a coup, and he overthrew the left wing of the Ba'ath party. Actually, Hafiz al-Assad was expelled from his position as defense secretary right before he took power in a coup, because there was the event of Black September. People might have heard of it in Jordan, whereby the Jordanian monarchy cracked down massively on the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. Syria was sent in to support the PLO, and Hafiz al-Assad, who was effectively the strong man of the state, even though he wasn't president, as defense minister, not defense secretary, as defense minister, he refused to send the Palestinians air cover, air force, and so he was actually expelled from his own party. But it didn't matter because he took power in a coup anyway. And the regime was based, like I said, on a reliance on Alawites in those key military and security and intelligence. Intelligence apparatuses are very important in Syria. There's like 11, 12 of them. Every Syrian, to get some minor paperwork, has to go to something like Air Force intelligence, and I don't know what. Like, there's so many intelligence apparatuses. This is where I distinguish between a country like Egypt or Yemen, which I would call an authoritarian state, and Syria, which I would call a totalitarian state. And I think this was the main difference. Like in a place like Damascus, you had insane number of informers and secret mukhabarat intelligence agents working for the state. Like the proportion, I don't remember, there was a statistic which was like, for every 2 in the population there was 1 or something. Maybe that's wrong, but like it was quite poignant. It's not useful mentioning the statistic if I don't remember, I guess. But this where it was a very close state. Even in Egypt, there was some kind of room for criticism and public venting to an extent, not massively, but to an extent. Like the Muslim Brotherhood were able to run independence in parliament, for instance, in Egypt. In Syria, all these kind of opposition activities weren't allowed at all. Back to the point. So the regime relied on those. This is why the regime couldn't Assad. This is why the regime couldn't sacrifice the family, because if you sacrifice the family, the Alawite sect were terrified what happens next. If the Sunni opposition, the Sunni majority take power, obviously the regime kind of promoted this thing that they're going to eat you alive, the minorities are going to be eaten alive. And so they knew that if they lose Assad, it's not like in Egypt you can replace one general with another, because they're all Sunnis, there's no sectarian dynamic. If the regime loses Assad himself, the figurehead, the symbol, right? I don't think Assad runs everything in Syria at all, by the way. Like people often, that's why I use the term the regime. I think Assad, it doesn't, like when he says things in interviews like I don't believe there are barrel bombs that are being used and whatever, he might be a psychotic liar, because even his own regime admit such things often unwittingly in like TV appearances and stuff like this, or he might genuinely not know what's happening in the country. I wouldn't, okay, this is my personal aside, but I wouldn't completely exclude that. Ultimately, he's not the main. There are other people who want him there, and there are other people who have a lot to lose if he goes. So if Assad goes, this means his replacement would likely have to be a Sunni, and this means that you lose a lot of privilege for this class, at least, that had risen to the top of these institutions, and this is why they stuck by him. Also, however, the Sunni bourgeoisie in places like Damascus and Aleppo also stood by him to a large extent. So this is why I don't want to say that it was just an Alawite regime, and that's a simplification. In Damascus, the city itself, it didn't see nearly any protests, I think. The suburbs of Damascus did, the working class suburbs did. Aleppo also as well, East Aleppo, the working class neighborhoods of Aleppo revolted a year late, but they did revolt eventually. But West Aleppo didn't. And this is often reflected in military control. If you go on a map and see which areas are controlled by what, it's not a coincidence generally that the areas which had big protests tend to be controlled by the rebels. The areas which didn't have protests tend to be controlled by the regime. So where are we now? So U.S. policy towards the conflict. So between 2011 and 2013, the US actually overtly, explicitly opposed the arming of the rebellion, and they even said things, there were statements at the time saying things like arming the rebels would only escalate the violence, which is what Assad wanted, and things like this. And there was a lot of rhetoric at that time saying that both the opposition and the regime have to silence their guns. So they weren't for arming the rebellion. However, there were other parties that did want to arm the rebellion, mainly Qatar, which for some reason supported a lot of that. Not for some reason, they have their reasons, but Qatar has always been a pariah in the region for supporting some form of democratization. Al Jazeera is Qatar, don't underestimate how important Al Jazeera is as an arm of the Qatari state. And this is why Qatar has always been hated by other regimes in the region, Gulf and non-Gulf, because they view it as a troublemaker. Like Al Jazeera growing up in the Middle East, it was the only one that would talk about things like corruption in Egypt or authoritarianism in Egypt or Tunisia or Syria. It constantly shed a light, and this is why Qatar was hated. And it was part of a coherent foreign policy on behalf of Qatar. So Qatar did want to arm the rebels straight away. Qatar did push for a military solution for the rebels. And so by 2012, the opposition itself started also self-fundraising their own funds for weapons, and started, at the beginning, most of their weapons were overwhelmingly captured from the battlefield. But then they started fundraising and trying to get weapons from external sources as well, and arms dealers. In this period, actually, the CIA routinely would prevent such weapons going in. And this might sound surprising because a lot of people think that the Americans have armed the rebels. The logistics of arming the rebels is very, very misunderstood. So what the US did at this time was, they knew that these weapons were coming in anyway, whether via private funding, private donations, or whether by states like Qatar and later Saudi Arabia. And they wanted to control what happens. So they said, okay, although we don't agree with arming the rebels, and there are quotes to this effect, we understand that others have a different opinion, and therefore we will coordinate the shipments. So this coordination, the form it took, and this is, like I say, it's reported actually, it exists in the archives, it exists in the sources. I've collected a lot of them over the years, but it's not in the alternative kind of narratives on the conflict, it's not well known. Is that the US actually stopped the provision of, first of all, heavy type of weaponry for a long time, and also quantities. They restricted the quantities of weaponry. So the main vehicles through which they did this, there were two, what they call operation rooms. The MOC in Jordan, which runs through Amman, and MOM in Turkey. It stands for Military Operation Center, and Military Operation M is something for center in Turkish. And through these operation rooms, they coordinated, the US especially, along with the host countries Jordan or in Turkey, they coordinated arms shipments coming mainly from, like I said, private donations, but mainly actually from Saudi Arabia and Qatar. In the south, it was mainly Saudi Arabia that put arms in. In the north, Qatar and Turkey had a much bigger influence. And these terms are very important, the MOC and the MOM, because that's how the Syrians call them, MOC and MOM, because they controlled a lot of effectively how the war trajectory went, and minor battlefield dynamics. So, for instance, the rebels would launch an unauthorized offensive on Damascus. This happened in 2013. And you had rebels then complaining midway through their offensive, because they didn't take permission from the MOC in Jordan, all ammunition supply lines would get cut off. More importantly, anti-aircraft missiles have been completely banned from the rebels, effectively, for the past 6 years, and they've been begging for them, and I've watched them beg for them for the past 6 years, because of a US veto, not a Russian veto. The US is who prevented the provision of anti-aircraft missiles. Now, that doesn't mean I don't mean that by saying that the US didn't provide them itself. I meant, no, they actually vetoed third-party provisions. So Qatar and Saudi Arabia, for instance, they have the ability to give those weapons. They have them in their stockpiles, and again, a lot has been written on this, and it's the US that always did the veto. Why? Because they knew it would completely change the equilibrium on the ground, the situation on the ground. If Assad doesn't have his air force, then he loses. Then effectively you can count that the regime will collapse, basically. No government in history, I think, in the past, since 2012, has been deploying air power. I think the statistic is, I've not seen it mentioned elsewhere, but anyone can feel free to correct me, but no government in history has deployed an air force and aerial power inside its borders for as long as the Syrian regime has. The last maybe comparable example was Franco in the Spanish Civil War, and that wasn't as long as this. So since 2012, and this is what we see on our news feeds as Arabs and Muslims or whatever, and this is why a lot of Muslims went to Syria, because this is what we've been seeing every single day. footage of massacres, markets being bombed, people wailing, people screaming, people saying, "Where are the Arabs? Where are the Muslims? You're leaving us like this." And every single day we've been seeing this for the last 6 years. So Assad's air force effectively was able to operate, in a sense, because of U.S. facilitation. So the way I see the U.S. support, and this is where I maybe even differ from people on my side of this debate or the conflict, is the U.S. position on the conflict has actually been even more pro-regime fundamentally, and more in a sense of it prevented the collapse of the regime much more efficiently than Russia's intervention. And what I mean by that is that Russia didn't have the agency or the capacity to influence what the opposition could get in terms of arms from outside. It wasn't in a position to stop that. But it was the US that did this. And it did this, like I said, through these operation groups, also through diplomatic pressure. Again, 2012, 2013, you can go and see like the US repeatedly calling the Arab allies to, reduce weapons going into the country and coordinate them better with the US. And again, there was a lot of examples of weapon shipments being stopped at the Turkish border, for instance, by the CIA. This happened in 2012. 2013, there was a mini kind of US-Saudi conflict whereby Saudi put in like a lot of weapons, and they bought a lot of weapons for the rebels in the south of the country, and they were just stockpiled in warehouses in Jordan. The US, the CIA, and the Jordanians didn't allow it into the country. So in this sense, the US position is much more subtle and nuanced, and this is why there's such misunderstanding on the conflict. It was, the first preference basically was a political solution, like I say, where the regime itself sacrifices Assad. The regime itself, the power centers within the regime itself tell Assad, it's time to step down, otherwise you're taking us all down with you, as happened, like I said, in places like Egypt and Yemen. This wasn't available, like I said, due to the dynamic of the regime is Assad, the regime is the family, the regime is the sect, basically, in that sense. The sect knows if they sacrifice Assad, they don't know what will happen next. So this is why it was different. So the first preference, and this is why a lot of people have criticized the US, they've said your policy doesn't make sense. You know that the regime will never sacrifice Assad. You know that there's no so-called political solution with Assad, with the regime. You know it's never going to happen. Because when we say political solution, it means they're opposing any military solution. And what I mean by that is they oppose, let's say, a rebel offensive in an area next and near Damascus. They oppose the rebel. In 2012, again, another example was the rebels took East Aleppo, from the countryside, from the poor countryside, rural kind of, it was one of the poor areas, and they took a lot of the eastern neighborhoods, and then again ammunition supplies completely stopped coming from Turkey, and they were on the verge of taking the entire city of Aleppo. And this has happened repeatedly, these forms of tacit interventions which are aimed at preserving one side tilting. And a lot of rebels have said this actually themselves. They've said the US policy is that they don't want either side to win. And that every time we're on the verge of winning, you find supply lines will ever get cut off from Turkey and Jordan. Every time the regime maybe is about to finish the conflict, maybe the tap, there was a famous quote, maybe Nick might remember it, because I think it was an article by Mark, and he said basically, a rebel commander said, the tap, they loosen the tap a bit, they close the tap a bit. They loosen the tap a bit, they close the tap a bit. Which is very cynical. Effectively, it's just continuing the conflict for a very long time. Anyway, so they prevented in that sense the collapse of the regime. I see it like this. So if Russia bombed this place, right? If a Russian airplane came and bombed this place, maybe a lot of people will die eventually, right? Maybe the fire will consume everything. But if it's the Americans that are the ones that hid the fire extinguisher from the people who were there. And this is why I feel it as more cynical, and this is why it frustrates me a lot that people cannot see past the Assad should step down statements and see the actual realities. Of course, it requires a lot of studying, don't get me wrong, and Syria is complex in terms of its details, but they couldn't see past this surface level and see the actual policy, whether in regards to arms. Between 2014 2017, for instance, the US has bombed rebels many times. By rebels, I mean anti-ISIS rebels, mainstream opposition forces, groups not designated as terrorists. Again, these are things that people don't know about, and a lot of the left don't know about this, a lot of anti-war movements don't know about this. So when we see something like a massive outrage about Trump bombing an empty airfield after warning the regime in advance about it, that's happened in 2017 after the chemical attack, or more recently when they hit 4 empty buildings and no one even got killed, after again bragging about it on Twitter for a week before that, we view these things as completely symbolic, and we're like, okay, where were you when 50 people got killed in a US airstrike? a month before the famous Trump strike on the airfield in 2017, in April 2017. Just a few weeks before that, U.S. airstrike killed 50 people in a mosque in a rebel-held village. Not ISIS-held village, a rebel-held village. Where were the protests? Where was the outrage? It doesn't exist. There have been at least a dozen times of the U.S. bombing mainstream opposition forces, groups like Ahrar al-Sham, who I might not ideologically agree with them. They're too conservative for my liking. But here comes in the fact that people don't understand what Islamism is. This is maybe... Sorry, I know I'm probably going into way different trajectories, but people don't understand what Islamism is. People understand Islamism as straight away jihadis, extremists, whatever. But Islamism is a huge spectrum. And in a sense, the Syrian rebels, you can call them Islamists in the majority, but this is kind of it's a non-definition. It's a useless word, because if you define Islamism as Muslims believing that Islam is political, or believe that Islam has a role in legislation, then most Muslims around the world are Islamists. Because whether we agree with it or not, right, most Muslims around the world do not believe in a separation of religion and state. Not in that sense. They believe that Islam is political inherently. And the Syrians were no different. The Syrian rebels, and they come from these communities, were no different. They are, and this is why I disagreed with some liberal coverage, let's say from Al Jazeera. I remember 2011, 2012, I'd see things like saying, the secular Free Syrian Army. I'm like, no, they're not secular. And I knew they're not secular because I used to watch their videos, I used to watch their rhetoric, and it's clearly religious. And it doesn't mean they're extreme, but they have religious heritage. They mention maybe a verse from the Quran, they mention a narration of the Prophet Muhammad, they're not seculars. They're not like the YPG, let's say, the Kurds. The Kurds are clearly, in a sense, irreligious politically. They're not religious politically. The rebels have always had this religious dynamic. But does that mean that they're extremists or that they want to savage all the minorities? No. And this is where we have to distinguish between secularism and pluralism. In the sense, in our region, the Syrian regime, for sure, I would say it's a secular regime. In the sense of, by and large, it doesn't mean that it's 100% secular. But even the Queen here is the head of the church. But I'm saying, relatively speaking, Islam was not, or Islamic ethics or principles or politics was not a major ideological kind of guide of regime policies. I'd say the same in Egypt as well. I'd say these regimes, relative to their kind of environment, are by and large secular. But does that mean that they're not sectarian? No. And this is where there's a difference between secularism and sectarianism. And somebody's written about this, secular sectarianism. So sectarianism in the sense of being tribal, in the sense of divide and conquer. France is, it's all about la cité and stuff like this. But when they went into Syria, what did they do? They did a divide and conquer according to sectarian divisions, even though they're clearly a secular country. I don't think France cares whether you're Sunni or Alawite in Syria, but the way they colonized the country is, for instance, the Syrian army was founded effectively as a colonial indigenous proxy army by the French, and it was only minorities which would be allowed to enter, because the French viewed the main nationalist opposition to their occupation as Sunni dominated. They gave the Alawites autonomy in the northwest. The Alawite state was part of the French mandate, the Druze state. They divided the country, and basically they were saying, look, and they got, initially actually there were Alawite revolts at the beginning, right at the beginning of the mandate. There was even a Druze-led revolt, I think, as well. But eventually they co-opted them. They were like saying, look, we are your allies against this majority, this Sunni majority that has often repressed you in the past. And this is a fact that the Ottomans, for instance, who were Sunni, did repress the Alawites in the past. There's a reason the Alawites are in the mountains. They had to run away and go there. So I'm not denying this. And when I have opposition friends who say that we never had an issue with sectarianism, it was all Assad, it's not true. There was sectarianism, there was persecution of, let's say, the Alawites, and this is why Alawites remember this. They remember how it was before the regime, before the Ba'ath came to power. They remember that they were overwhelmingly poor, that they used to serve as housemaids and stuff like this in the houses of the Sunni notables in the cities. They remember this, and this is why they're very scared of what comes after. I don't know where I am.
You could wrap up a bit.
Yeah.
If you want to.
Yeah, so I was saying, there were many examples of the US bombing rebel factions, and often it would be like mainstream rebel factions. We're not including things like Jabhat al-Nusra, which is a rebel faction. I don't like it. It's an extremist. It's Al-Qaeda linked. I don't like it. But when we categorize Syria, I suppose you can categorize Syria broadly as four sides, broadly speaking. Of course, there are divisions within each side. The rebels, the regime, the YPG, the Kurds, and ISIS. I don't consider ISIS to be an opposition group, and most Syrians don't consider ISIS to be an opposition group. Not because of their abhorrence, but because the fact is they spent a lot of their time fighting opposition as much as they did fighting the regime. And during their foundational period, they fought the opposition more than they fought the regime between 2013 and 2015. Overwhelmingly, they fought the opposition more than the regime. And in fact, they had a religious, this is a side note, but they had an interesting religious justification, which is, does anyone know what apostate means? Okay, so an apostate in Islam is like supposedly somebody who was Muslim and he left the religion, he defected, basically. It's different from an infidel who, like, you guys are infidels, basically, you know? I'm joking, obviously, but you guys are not Muslim to start with, right? So an apostate, they cite this kind of principle in Islamic jurisprudence completely out of context from the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Basically, the Muslims then, the early Muslim community, were at war with the pagans had them under siege. And you used to have people who would go into the Muslim camp, profess their declaration of faith, say we want to be Muslims now, and then they would defect back. They would go back and join, effectively spies. And so the apostasy law, which is often misunderstood and often used by the right, is like saying that the Muslims, they want to kill anybody who leaves Islam because they're not convinced by it. No, this is completely decontextualized. It was mainly a treason law, effectively. Even treason law here, you have like capital punishment for treason law. I don't know about the UK, but the US, I think it does. So it was mainly about the apostate. Literally, the Arabic word for it is murtad, which means those who bounce back. That's literally what it was. So it was about a very specific category of people during that time of warfare when the early Muslims were under siege. People would go in, pretend to be Muslim, and then leave and join the enemy and use the information they gained. So ISIS, what they did is that they view obviously Alawites, Shias, all of these categories. They view them to be infidels. They don't view them to be Muslims. They only view Sunnis to be Muslims. But because of the opposition, they didn't, and a lot of Sunnis in opposition-held areas, both armed and civilian, refused to pledge allegiance to their so-called caliphate in 2013, 2014 when they declared it. They said that they're apostates. They said that the Sunni opposition or the Sunni rebels who don't pledge allegiance to them are apostates. And basically that makes them, and this is what the maxim that they used, they said to defend themselves against accusations, why are you attacking the opposition, not attacking the regime? They said an apostate is more of a danger to Islam and to the Islamic community than an infidel. And the principle is, the apostate is the near and present danger. The infidel is the far and removed danger. We'll fight the Americans, we'll fight the Russians eventually, whatever. But these guys are from within the community, and so they threaten your legitimacy within your popular constituency. And so this is why for a very long time, they were fighting the opposition more than they were fighting the regime. Anyway, yeah, I went on to so many tangents, I apologize for that. I think I'll probably leave it there.
Okay, thank you so much.